Well, thank you again. Nir and I are old friends and colleagues, and it's really a delight to be here at your beautiful campus, which I have not been to before in the daytime on a beautiful day in a room with no windows. So, a couple of years ago, I published, as Nir mentioned, a book about legal reasoning. And the thesis was this, that the core of thinking like a lawyer, for those of you who are planning to go on to law school, is formal deductive logic. And that lawyering, at its heart, is this skill of fitting real-world narratives into a series of, I'll use a technical term, modus ponens sentences that together become a legal theory. Modus ponens is this. It's the rule of inference that goes, if P, then Q. If you have P, the antecedent condition, then the consequence is Q. And the major premise is the rule, the if-then statement. So here's an example that I use with some of my first-year contract students. A young person on a snowy winter morning, say a Sunday, walks by my driveway. I am sitting there in my kitchen with my mocha java, enjoying watching the snowfall. And the young person has a snowblower, sees me in the kitchen, and traces that, actually for you it should be that, in the air, a question mark. And I respond with this, a thumbs up sign. And she clears the driveway with her snowblower, walks up, knocks on the door, and asks me for $50. And when I decline to pay, this is what makes it a law school hypothetical, she sues me. And one of the questions in the legal theory is going to be, one of the elements in her claim will be, did I make a promise? Did I make a promise? And the answer will come by the way of this modus ponens logic. If X, then, I'm sorry, if P, then Q. And here's the legal rule. Here's the legal rule. So if you do go to law school, you're one up on everybody else. If X, if I manifested an intention to pay, made so as to justify the person on the driveway in believing I had so committed, right, the thumbs up, then the legal consequence flows from that. It must be that that action, that set of events, was a promise, right? It was a promise. So in my book, I explored some of the issues that arise from allowing the logic of thinking like a lawyer, the sequence of logical propositions that make up lawyering, the consequence that came from allowing that logic to get separated from other hallmarks of thinking, other hallmarks besides logic of good sense and good judgment. And so the title was Beyond Legal Reasoning, A Critique of Pure Lawyering, my reference to Kant, but I'm not going to get into that here. And one of the themes of the book was that deciding or choosing and then acting on the choice is somehow fundamentally different than merely reasoning, whether by way of a lawyer's logic or otherwise, and that was particularly human. Now, I wasn't thinking as much about computers when I wrote the book as I was about algorithms and problem setting. That is, once you've identified the rule you would like to apply to the narrative as a lawyer to derive a legal consequence, the logic takes over. But what's the mental process by which you, what is the mental process by which you identify the candidates for the applicable rules in that situation? And that spark, that particular intuition, that aha moment of pattern recognition struck me as the particularly human moment. And when I gave a talk about the book at Suffolk, now about a year and a half ago, one of my friends from Cambridge, an evolutionary biologist friend, asked why I seemed to be so sure that that aha moment was human, or so human. And the example that he gave me was, I don't know how many of you are familiar with AlphaGo, the computer that plays the game of Go and beat a Go master by doing something that looked like it was indeed intuitive. And so I started, based on his question, thinking about what computers could and couldn't do, at least as applied to lawyering. And what I was thinking was, since I'm a law professor, if I am going to be in the business, at least for the rest of my now fleeting career, if I'm going to be educating human lawyers, what are the aspects of lawyering that would be the hardest for a computer to do? Because that seems to me ought to be our pedagogical focus. We ought to work on what humans can do best, because the computers are going to do the rest. And the result was I wrote 2 articles addressing the potential and the limits of algorithmic thinking for lawyers. And the punchline has to do with the difference between what I call the finite regress of digital computation and the infinite regress of choosing a rule of action. And so the 2 subjects on which I want to spend the remainder of my time here with you are point 1. Is there a theoretical limit to the capability of a digital computer that bears on my thesis, that deciding is somehow different than reasoning? So that's number 1. Oops, there we go. In short, what are the limitations on robot lawyers generally? Point number 2, the hot topic in AI and the law right now is something called smart contracts. And so the question I'm posing is AI capable of replacing the kind of thinking that lawyers have done historically when they take real-world narratives and translate them into legalese, into things called contracts? So that's point number 2, smart contracts. So I'm going to move on to point 1. This is the question of the theoretical limitation on robot lawyers. And my thought experiment went like this. Here is a human lawyer, and I am going to assume the most capable of all possible robot lawyers, and this is what it looks like. If I were to design a law school curriculum from scratch, and I wanted to focus on the very hardest thing for the robot lawyer to do vis-a-vis a human lawyer, what would the curriculum look like? And so I wanted to think about what are the ultimate limitations on a robot lawyer with an AI brain. And so I'm going to talk about those, and I'm going to ask you to hold on because this involves some math theory as applied to digital computation. I am a lapsed mathematician. The lapse occurred about 46 years ago, so I don't know enough to confuse you too much. But I want to talk about a little bit of math theory as underlies computers. Over 100 years ago, one of the world's great mathematicians, a man by the name of David Hilbert, issued a series of challenges to his profession at a big conference in 1900. And one of the challenges was to prove on a meta basis that every mathematical statement was provable or decidable. In other words, what he was saying was mathematicians should be able to prove that every mathematical statement can be proved, starting from a finite number of axioms and applying a finite number of rules of inference to get to the conclusion. You should be able to prove that you can prove anything. It's not about the proof of a particular theorem, but about the proof of theorems generally. Can you prove that you can prove anything? And it was called the decision problem, in German, the Entscheidungsproblem. Can you prove mathematically the meta-statement about being able to prove any mathematical statement? And Alan Turing, his claim to fame before code breaking and the Imitation Game movie was he showed that the answer to that meta question was no. And his trick was to demonstrate even one true statement in mathematics that was not provable in a series of discrete steps from finite axioms. And what is relevant to computing is how he undertook that task. The mathematical statement that he chose was, quote, this number is computable. For example, can I prove that the square root of 2 is always computable from a finite number of axioms and a finite number of rules of inference or logic? And it seems like it is, because you can actually write a computer program that will calculate the square root of 2. I just have to figure out how many digits I want to get it to, because it is an irrational number and it goes on forever. But can I prove it's computable? And so to undertake the project, Turing imagined a machine that in practice became the modern digital computer. He came up with the idea of a machine that could compute anything that was computable. Can a machine calculate the square root of 2? The answer is yes. But if you ask the machine while it was running the program, will you reach a conclusion to this problem? Can it do that? And if it can't, then the decision problem is not solvable. And the punchline is that every conceivable digital computer, including the one inside my robot brain, at its core is a version of this original hypothetical machine, this Turing machine, that Alan Turing made up as a thought experiment. So you have the spinning wheel going on your Mac, and the question is your computer just slow, or is it stuck in a loop? That was the question. Will it get to an answer, or do you need to shut down? Well, in some cases, but not all, the computer can't tell you. It doesn't know. And how Turing proved this was pretty cool. His imaginary machine, remember, computers at the time meant people who actually sat there and computed with pencil and paper. His imaginary machine solved computation problems in a series of discrete steps. And the way it worked was he had a tape, an infinite tape that was cut into squares. And a scanner would run along the tape. And it worked as follows. The scanner would always be in some defined state. At the beginning, it might be in the start state. At the end, it might be in the halt state. But what would happen is the scanner would move along the tape, and it would read the symbol that happened to be in the square of the tape the scanner was scanning. And it looked something like this, right? Zeros and ones. And the scanner would have instructions on what it was supposed to do given that state and that symbol. For example, if you're in this particular state and you see a 0, well, then you should move 2 spaces to the right, erase the symbol, and change to a different state, right? That's what the instructions were. And what was the scanner? Well, the scanner was a program, right? And what was the tape? The tape is the input. And when the machine works, we're going to call it running program P on input I. Does this start to sound familiar? Here's another way of visualizing it. There is a program for deciding something. And we feed in data that is relevant to the analysis. P computes an answer, and it stops. And can we install a program that gives a, no, I'm sorry, but what we want to know is while P is running, can there be a program that tells us all the time that P will reach an answer? That's the question. Can we install a program that gives us the answer? And again, this was Turing's proof by contradiction, because what he does is he assumes such a program exists. And then he runs out the logic, and if he reaches a contradiction, then he knows that his assumption that the program exists cannot be true. So we run I on P, but what we're going to do now is we're going to add a program called H that can answer the question, if P is running on I, if program P is running on I, will P halt or go into a loop and just spin, right? There it is. There's program H. Does P halt on input I? Does it stop, or does it go into a loop? H answers yes if P will halt with an answer, or no if it goes into a loop. That's what P does. I'm sorry, what H does. Now it gets a little tricky. Can we run P on itself? Can we run a program P in which the input is program P. And think of it this way. Think of a program that counts lines of code. Could you run the program counting lines of code on the program that counts lines of code? Yes, you could. And so what we're going to do, we're going to call the program that tests P running on itself H+. H+ is our loop tester. It's designed to tell us if the program goes into a loop or not. It contains P, the original program, and it runs the underlying program on the designated input, and then it tests to see if the program running that input will halt or go into a loop. If H sees the underlying program go into a loop, it has done its job and it halts. So H, the tester, halts. If, on the other hand, it sees the program continuing to run, it doesn't know if it's going to go into a loop or not because it's just running, and so it keeps running until it finds out. So H runs as long as the program runs. Now that's, okay, cool. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to make your brains explode because what we're going to do is we're going to run H+ on itself. We're going to run H+ on itself. What happens if we run H+ on itself? Remember, H+ is the program that tests whether P running on P halts or loops. And H+ is the entire program within my white circle. Does H+, the program, running on H+ as the input, halt or loop? And now we have a contradiction. Why? It's because if H+ determines that H+ loops, it has done its job and it halts, right? But if H+ determines that H+ continues to run, H+ goes into a loop. Think about what that means. It means that H+ loops if it halts, and it halts if it loops, which means that H+ and derivatively, which is the loop tester, which was the very first assumption, cannot be true. It is a proof by contradiction. And the question is, so the question whether this particular matter is computable has no answer. And that limitation is inherent in every digital computer, because every digital computer is a Turing machine. Every digital computer is a Turing machine. And so the question is, what's the implication for artificial intelligence? And if you are an AI person, like the several that I've spoken to, who are leaders in AI, I'm going to use the nicer words that they used when they talked to me about it. Chances are that you don't think that there is any implication. Either it's irrelevant to what AI is doing, or it's a red herring because they think that brains are just computers anyway, just with meatware rather than hardware. So in their view, if machines have deciding problems, so do humans. If you come from another discipline, say philosophy, you're more likely to differ. And I think the reason is the infinite regress, which is AI machines need goals. And what are the goals? Who sets the goals? Is there an algorithm for goal setting? If so, what's the goal for the algorithm for goal setting? And so down the infinite regress. When do you simply stop and decide to decide? Right? That's the question. And it seems to me that the halting problem is relevant to that. So, again, it's enough for me to decide that the deciding problem is hard and unresolved. And humans do presently seem to have a greater ability to decide. So I suspect that lawyer robots are going to end up being able to do a lot of substantive things that lawyers do. I have this vision that you're going to be able to feed a narrative into the computer, and it's going to spit out the draft of a brief for you. And I think that it's going to be able to do that better than humans do. So if I were the emperor of legal education, and trust me, I'm never going to be, I would focus on deciding. What is it that lawyers do to decide or set goals that is, at least theoretically, at the very edge of what computers are capable of doing. Okay, so that's point one, robot lawyers and their limitations. Point two, which may have more general appeal. Those of you who are English literature scholars, per Dick the Butcher in the play Henry VI, can we kill all the lawyers and replace them with robots, at least when it comes to writing contracts? And I should say, I believe that everything that can be digitized will be digitized. The more important question is there anything that can't be digitized? And if so, what's the consequence? And contract law, something I know a fair amount about, is just a foil in that thought experiment. So, smart contracts are all the rage right now. Smart contracts now run on a technology called blockchain, which I'm sure all of you have heard about in one way or another. And in blockchain, computers all over the world keep what is called a distributed ledger of publicly recorded but privately owned transactions, all of which are irreversible once made. And the most famous thing that runs on blockchain is Bitcoin, or cryptocurrency. The technicalities are not important, and frankly, if they were important, I wouldn't be able to explain them to you. You own an abstract coin that exists in a virtual ledger on a computer somewhere. The ledger has an element in the code that identifies the coin as yours. It's a long string of numbers. And the outside world can see that somebody owns the coin, and they can even tell from the code it's, you know, the long string of numbers, but they can't identify you. You have a secret key to the coin. If you want to sell it to somebody else, the coin takes on a new ownership code, and it cannot be reversed. It is simply a new block in the chain of ownership. It is completely irreversible. So blockchain started as a technology for cryptocurrency. It has applications, however, in the law whenever you are recording the movement of assets. So if you're a manufacturing company and you want to trace the movement of plastic from somewhere in Eastern Europe through Western Europe to the US, you can use blockchain technologies to follow that along. An outfit calling itself Block Geeks will teach you how to code blockchain for things like apartment leasing, supply chains, automobile insurance, and healthcare. And here's the pitch that they have. This is a screenshot from their website. Smart contracts, the blockchain technology that will replace lawyers. And so my question is this puffing, right? Is it really serious, or is this just a way of selling something on the web? And the thesis in my thought experiment, again, is that smart contracts, like robot lawyers, have their limits. And the article that I've written about it is that dumb contracts will persist. So I'm limited here in the amount of time that I have to bald assertions. But my assertions will deal with three subjects. For you philosophers, ontology. Also for your philosophers, language. For you coders, code. And in the spirit of somebody by the name of Carl Llewellyn, who was a great legal scholar of the 20th century and a contract law scholar, something that he called situation sense, right? Being in the moment and making a decision about what to do. So first I want to talk about ontology. Understanding the distinction between smart contracts and dumb contracts means, to my mind, assessing what we deem to be real, right? Which is the work of ontology. And the metaphor for making a contract between two people is the meeting of the minds. I should tell you, I despise the metaphor because I think it's either doctrinal nonsense or metaphysical garbage. And when my students use meeting of the minds, I launch into impression of Spock doing the Vulcan mind meld. Like, where is the meeting of the minds? You got a brain here and a brain here. Where's the meeting? So I like to talk about being real and getting real about real. So I think, for example, the warping of space-time by gravity is real. I think that the wave-particle duality is real. And there's a science, physics, that maps reality in models and rules that do not change over time and conserve information. In theory, you can trace the state of the physical universe backward and forward. And the epitome of a smart contract, a Bitcoin, is smart for reasons very much akin to the relationship of physical reality and its models in physics. That is, smart contracts create their own ontology. When you enter into one, you really fully accept the reality of the game you've opted to play. The smart contract is not a map of another transaction. It's a real thing. A Bitcoin is an artifact that constitutes the understanding. Artifacts can take on meaning, right? Artifacts, things that humans make, can take on meaning so universal and so objective as to constitute social facts. But it's a social reality, not a physical reality. So, for example, take that. That's a dollar bill. That is a piece of paper with ink on it. Nothing in nature requires any of us to recognize that as a dollar bill. But a dollar bill is a dollar bill by universal consensus, and you would have to be insane or somehow on drugs not to understand the meaning of that particular piece of paper. A dollar bill means the same thing to me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that it does to a Chinese entrepreneur in Guangzhou. And a dollar bill may change in, oops, I want to see, this is what happens when you, a dollar bill may change in value relative to another currency over time, but it's going to mean the same thing as a dollar bill in 2050 that it means today. And if you consider a smart contract system like Bitcoin, built on blockchain, the core of the system is its immutability. It does not change. It is final. And smart contracts like Bitcoin get smart because they create social realities in which there are indeed discrete and finite states of the world, a smart universe that is governed by rules as immutable as in physics. The Bitcoin is what it is because it does not change. For economists, a smart contract is the dream. In a little bit of economic theory, the perfect but unattainable contract in economic terms is called complete. That is, you would write a contract that anticipates every state contingency of the world, right? We decide that we're going to have a long-term lease or we're going to have a merger agreement. We would write an agreement that anticipates every eventuality, right? And a dumb contract, in my mind, is one with precisely the opposite characteristics. It does not create its own ontology. It is rather a linguistic or a language map. And it's a map in the same way that a map is the map of Cambridge. If a map of Cambridge were Cambridge, it wouldn't be of much use because it's too detailed. What makes it valuable as a map is we reduce it, and it has enough similarity to the reality that it becomes useful. And that's, to me, what dumb contracts are. They are contracts that do not create their own ontology. They are linguistic maps of another reality. And, you know, we don't live in a smart universe. We live in a dumb universe. We transact business in a dumb universe. It is physically continuous, and it has infinite states. And it seems to me that the smart contract universe is going to be digital, predictable, and precise. The dumb contract universe is going to be continuous, marked by radical uncertainty and fuzzy, just like the one we live in. So that's the ontology aspect of smart contracts. Dumb contracts are going to persist because it's a dumb universe. It's not digital. Second, language, and this is where we talk about language, logic, and code. If you posit a smart universe, its natural language is computer code. And it goes back to the previous part of the talk. All of reality consists of a state of states in which you move in discrete steps. The reality that the smart contract creates is capable of being replicated on any universal Turing machine which is a digital computer. So the language of the smart contract is obliged not only to be expressible in a formal logic, but it has to be computable. And the hallmarks of computability in coding language is there is a strict syntax, the expressions in the language have no inherent meaning, and there is almost no ambiguity, near or complete ambiguity. And here the distinction between something being formally logical and computable is critical. And so I'm going to, again, teach you a little more law. Because my example comes from the great effort of the 20th century, the great effort of 20th century contract scholars to update the law. It is something known as Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code. So there is a special body of law in the United States that deals with contracts when you are selling goods, like a computer or a car, anything that's movable, as opposed to real estate or human services or whatever. And the primary author of Article 2 back in the mid-20th century was a Harvard scholar by the name of Carl Llewellyn. And what he wanted to do was make the law in the sale of goods more accurately track on how business people actually created their norms, business norms. And so Article 2 is famous for including all sorts of wiggle words in the law. Actions are often required in Article 2 to be reasonable or seasonable or whatever. And so, for example, when a merchant under the Uniform Commercial Code sells a good, a computer, the default rule, unless it's changed by contract, is that it is to be, and the term is merchantable. So if Apple sells me a computer, it is obliged under the law, if it doesn't make a separate contract with me, to sell me a merchantable computer. Well, what does that mean? It means that it is fit for the ordinary use as a computer. And that is an implied warranty in every good that gets sold by a merchant, that it will be merchantable, it will be fit, it will be non-defective. And even with its wiggle words, I can take Article 2 of the UCC and I can put it into a formal predicate logic that satisfies A and B of the coding definition. That is, it has a formal syntax, and the expressions in the language will have no inherent meaning. The problem is, to make it computable, I have to deal with those wiggle words. So now let me show you what I mean by this. I'm going to use an example. Judging competitive figure skating. Could you have an AI program that judges competitive figure skating? And I'm going to show you this. Oops, there's blockchain. This is what is known in figure skating as a Lutz jump. A Lutz jump, for those of you who aren't figure skaters, is a toe pick assisted jump with an entrance from a back outside edge and landing on the back outside edge of the opposite foot. Don't worry about that. Making the judge smart means translating the characteristics of a Lutz for the purpose of judging into sentences in first order predicate logic. And some of the predicates would be relatively objective criteria like the jump was high, the jump was long, the jump was fast, and those you can measure pretty objectively. But there are also going to be criteria that have sentences like this. The jump was pretty, or the jump was original. And on a scale between 0 and 10, for example, if those are your judging scales, the actual performance is capable of any of an infinite number of values within the finite interval. That is, the reality of the thing being measured is continuous. And however fine-tuned you make the measurement, you can always make it finer. You can always go one more decimal place out. So for things that are objective, like height, we'll simply agree that the measurement will use a finite and discrete set of numbers within the interval, and you round up to one of those numbers. And the digitization of those criteria We do all the time, and whether the jump is 36 inches high or 37 inches high doesn't depend on whether it's the Russian judge or the Kazakh judge or whatever. But the problem is subjective criteria, like the jump was pretty, are also continuous and capable of infinite values with the interval. The problem with the subjective criteria is indeed they are subjective. So to code them, right, to code them, the judge is going to make a subjective assessment and assign a discrete mark. And the replacement of that continuous range of values is more glaring because it's not because the subjective criteria are any more or less continuous than the objective. It's because we're far less comfortable taking conventionally the truth of the measurement as truth when we can't independently verify it. But you could have a smart AI judge that has stored millions of jumps, and there's an algorithm in there that manages to assign a discrete measurement of pretty or original. But again, what you're going to have to do is write code that takes this continuous range of possibilities and translates it into discrete individual numbers somewhere. Again, the predicate of pretty is perfectly capable of inserting into a logical structure. It can't be coded unless you translate it into something measurable on a discrete scale. And any assessment in the law that uses something like that, reasonable, merchantable, fit, anything in the law that has that kind of predicate to determine if it is legal or not legal, or okay or not okay, is going to have to be translated into something codable on a discrete scale. Again, you can express most of Article 2 of the law, and indeed I think this is true of most law, in a formal first predicate logical structure. So imagine a contract for the sale of coal. And imagine that the only applicable rule on fitness is the implied warranty of merchantability. The coal must be fit for its ordinary use. Sorry. Without getting into the specifics, this is a picture of the first order predicate logic that I've done within Article 2 of the UCC, going from the proposition that the coal is unfit to the idea that the buyer is entitled to get damages. In this form, it is logically impeccable, but it is not smart. Because the problem in making it smart is there is a predicate of fitness for ordinary use. To make it smart, I am going to have to code a proxy for what fitness is. And once again, you can imagine an AI smart contract that has stored millions of instances of fitness and can manage to assign a discrete measurement of fit. But you're going to have to code for it. You're going to have to translate something that is naturally fuzzy into something that is naturally discrete, or not naturally, something that is discrete. This, to me, is finally the most significant problem, and it is what I said before, situation sense. In the debates over AI, one of the most iconic images, and I don't know how many of you have seen this before, is something developed by the philosopher John Searle called the Chinese room. And this is how it works. The question that Searle is asking, and one, frankly, that I'm not very interested in, is a computer capable of being conscious like a human? And the thought experiment went like this. There is a person sitting in a sealed room not knowing any Chinese. The person has a set of instructions on how to translate from Chinese symbol to Chinese symbol. So a Chinese symbol will come in, and the person in the room is to send out the correct symbol using the guide that the person has there in this sealed room. So if that symbol comes in, that symbol goes out. If that symbol goes in, that symbol goes out. And smart contracts even, and by the way, it's generally agreed, this is a pretty accurate description of what's going on inside the central processing unit of a computer. Whether it actually answers the question of consciousness is another one entirely, and we won't get into that. But smart contracts, even if run with advanced AI, are the legal equivalent of this Chinese room. They are operating to generate legal results without an identifiable subjective viewpoint. And again, it's not that I care whether the AI application of the Uniform Commercial Code thinks like a human or has consciousness or whatever. My question or my concern is my questioning of its ability to have what Llewellyn called situation sense, which is the ability to make a judgment that is appropriate and unique for any unique circumstance. So, sure, we might be able to code some proxy for fitness in the Chinese room. What we can't do is code in a way that creates a contradiction in the program, in the logic gates of the program. So in the computer's logic gates, there can only be one output for any given input. That is the way a logic gate works in a computer. So let's imagine a contract for the sale of widgets. And the widgets can conform or not conform. Here I've got a conforming and a non-conforming widget. And the program is designed to spit out the conclusion of no breach if it senses a conforming widget. Imagine running that coal through some sort of scanner that can tell whether it's conforming or not. The program is designed to spit out the conclusion of no breach if it senses a conforming widget or breach if defective. And that's how it works inside the Chinese room. And it works perfectly if a conforming widget comes in. If a conforming widget comes in, no breach comes out. If a defective widget comes in, it says there's a breach. Here's the schizophrenia of Article 2 or any law. The legal computer cannot work if it has a choice of either breach or no breach for the same input. That does not work, right? The or in the middle of the computer does not work. It has to be one or the other. The code simply cannot work logically, much less computably, if a non-conforming product can result in either breach or no breach. And by the way, there's the first-order predicate logic showing the contradiction. There is a schizophrenia going on here if you want the law to include both legal norms and business norms. Law is binary. You either have a right or you don't have a right. The law of the excluded middle applies. It's one or the other. Business norms have no law of the excluded middle. What made sense when we wrote this contract may not make sense now. And this is business situation sense, and I can tell you this having been in the business world for now 45 years. I have a legal right under that contract. I choose not to exercise it for reasons having nothing to do with the contract. Situation sense is an infinite regress. You would need, if you wanted to program, could you program situation sense into the computer? Sure. But what you would have to do is put in a subprogram, right? A Chinese room inside the Chinese room with its own instructions on when it is that you don't enforce the legal rules that you would otherwise enforce. And of course, when does that kick in? Well, you'd have to have another subprogram for that. And all the way down. That's the infinite regress, right? How do you choose? And that's the irony of situation sense. To make the contract smarter, you have to make it human, which means making it dumber. So, again, to sum up the intersection of AI and contracts, the less the contract creates its own smart universe, and the more it's the mapping of an understanding, the dumber it's going to be. Smart contracts are smart contracts like bitcoins are social facts like dollar bills. Dumb contracts are not social facts. They're maps. And they have the same benefits and flaws as maps. Language. In a smart universe, law has impeccably predictable logic and code-like precision. But in a dumb universe, life isn't predictable and language isn't precise. And more than that, there's often utility in keeping the language vague. Situation sense. Smart contracts obey the law of the excluded middle, breach or no breach. Business norms don't obey it, and as long as we live in a dumb universe, dumb contracts are going to persist. But here is my more generalized takeaway, and I'm almost done, from this excursion into the underlying math of computing. Computing can be a proxy for deciding, if you can put enough into the program. It can be a proxy for deciding as analogously discrete pixels can be proxies for continuous waves. Right? If you have a digital television, it is translating the continuous waves of light into pixels, and then it's translating it back into continuous waves for your eyeballs. I think that there is something really fundamental in two unresolvable complementarities. Number one, the difference between our self-aware subjective perceptions inside looking out and the objective world, that's number one, and the difference between reasoning and acting. Here's what I think. I think it takes a subjective mind in a contained self to act. The brain in that self, the CPU, controls reason. The brain also controls the motor or action. Right? And deciding, thinking about something and then actually taking the leap is in this overlap between reasoning and acting. And it seems to me that that's what's most human-like. To have a right and not to assert it. To have a contract and not make a claim on it. To have inputs 1 and 1 come into the logic gate or the neuron and still be able to decide, to act, to choose whether the output is 1 or 0. Again, that's what I think is human and the infinite regress. And with that, I'm done.
Questions?
I hope your brains are still.
I think you're onto something, which is that there obviously is an emotional component to reasoning. When we sever the connection between the prefrontal cortex, or it's damaged,
Right.
and the emotional parts of the brain, people can't make judgments because they can't get the emotional oomph to satisfy and just say, I'm going to decide between this and that. But machines actually do this all the time, right? If you ask a machine to come up with a square root of 2, there's a rule built into it that says satisfice at 10 decimal points or 20 decimal points.
But the machine isn't doing the satisficing.
No, we tell the machine this is how you're going to satisfice.
Right.
It's programmed.
Right.
But it's not impossible, right? It's not. You're absolutely right that aesthetics, ethical judgments, all these things are things that we would have to, through big data. You may have heard about the recent self-driving car study where they asked 500,000 people, if it was 2 nuns versus 3 priests and blah, blah, blah.
The trolley, that's the trolley problem.
Yeah, right. And, well, they came up with, some very different cultural and, quote, ethical judgments around the world. But you could imagine doing the same thing with, judging athletic events, just as you said. You take the big data approach and you figure out what beauty means in this context.
Right.
So this doesn't really seem to be that intractable to me. But I think you're absolutely right. It is the huge problem in the field.
Yeah. So again, my response to that is twofold. First of all, that again, anything that is digital, any digital computer has a finite regress in the sense that somebody at the end of the day has to make a decision. There is an ultimate author with a capital A at the end. It's the programmer who decides what the 1s and the 0s mean, right? And we can say that about computers. It is still open about neurons. I'm not saying, I'm agnostic. By the way, because my title isn't the permanence of dumb contracts, it's the persistence of dumb contracts. Yeah. The second thing is, I agree with you. I'm working way out at the far end. And my example of, when people talk about self-driving cars, the example I always turn back to is flying on airplanes. I used to be in a company that made two different aspects of flying in a modern jet airliner. One is something called TCAS. It's traffic and collision avoidance systems, TCAS. It's what causes that there are no mid-air collisions in commercial aviation, because the computers in the planes see each other coming, and they notify pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, or traffic, traffic, traffic. And if nobody does anything else, it will actually pull one plane up and one plane down. The other is called ground procs, which basically the computer knows how to avoid what is called controlled flight into terrain, or crashing. And if you asked me, would I rather rely on a pilot or a TCAS system in a plane? Or would I rather rely on a pilot or a ground proc system? I'm going to tell you, I would not get on an airplane without TCAS or a ground proc system, because I way more trust them than I do pilots. Now, if you ask me, would I get on a plane without a pilot? I don't know, right? But so my feeling is, well, yeah, we'll have self-driving cars. We'll have self-driving cars, and because there will be a pilot in the car, you will be able to override it. And I think 50 years from now, people will look at self-driving cars the same way that I look at TCAS now. No big deal, right? Because I think, again, anything that can be digitized will be digitized. And so my thought experiments are always, what at the far end can't be? And let's focus on that for humans. Yeah. We need a microphone.
So in this litigious insecurity, where do you see judges who are the ultimate end goal of every contract and possible litigation?
Yeah,
and all of it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it turns out that Llewellyn's phrase situation sense is about judging, and about the particularly human aspect of judging. Because what he's saying is that every case, in a way, is unique. And the whole issue of judging isn't as I said at the very outset, once you decide which rule to apply, right? Once you've set the problem, the logic takes you to the consequence. The whole game is problem setting. How do you decide? It's that algorithm I'm going to use to solve the problem, not that algorithm. And so I think human judging is going to stick around for a long time, because I think that problem setting, rather than simply problem solving, is at the heart of what we will want to retain in judges.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So somewhat related to that, a couple comments. One is, when you look at the athletic event judging, this figure skating judging in particular, there is something fundamentally social and pattern recognition based.
Yes.
And the things that pass for AI, that get labeled as AI these days, aren't so much the clearly binary choice making that happens in any kind of algorithmic decision, but this far more complex emergent appearance of pattern recognition.
Right.
So the ability to recognize a face, or to recognize that there's a stop sign on the road
Right.
there somewhere, and there's also
Right.
a school bus, and this is,
Right.
and then there's some reasoning somewhere along the way.
Right.
And so it may be, and I'm not ready to assert this yet, but it may be that that at the root of your analysis is a fallacy about sort of the practical nature of the implementation of these systems.
No. I'm just delaying to make sure your question is over before I ponder that.
Yeah, and it's
You
not
won't be the first
well-formed.
person to accuse me of having fallacies in my conclusions.
Yeah, well, I would go back to the beginning rather than at the end. But and just as a completely separate aside, though, in your discussion of blockchain technology, I think one of the things that's important mean, you talk about, you know, the indisputable ownership, but the other thing that's important is non-repudiation is critical to how come those technologies are popular.
Well, the irreversibility of it, that once you have the additional block, you can never go back. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
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 I can't say that I didn't
Correct.
do my part to execute that side of the transaction.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Once it's in the chain, it's in the chain forever.
It's in the chain forever.
Yeah.
And then
I'm trying not to forget, because I actually had a reaction to
my first point.
the first point. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I'll stop there.
Okay. And I'm having a senior moment because now I can't remember.
So is pattern recognition?
Oh, pattern recognition. Yeah, pattern. Pattern recognition. So a couple of things come to mind. First of all, once you accept it socially, it becomes a social fact. So the thing that I'm thinking, anybody here follow tennis? So nowadays in tennis, line calls are done not by humans. They are done by humans, but there's this backup technology called ShotSpot. I have no clue if ShotSpot really is accurate or not. But once everybody accepts it as the governing rule, it's the governing rule, right? So, you know, you'll see, you know, they'll zero in and it misses the line by 1 pixel, and fine, we accept that, you know, because I don't know if it's actually capturing it that way or not. So that's one part of it, the social acceptance. If you accept the input and the output of the smart contract as determining your rights, that is a social convention, and that may well happen, sort of in the same way that I accept TCAS, as opposed to a pilot looking around and deciding if a plane is too close. The other piece of it, pattern recognition, is interesting because, again, as I've said, I can't code my way out of a paper bag. But I believe that the machine learning, right, the deep learning that you're talking about is in effect the programming of induction. What you're saying, right, what you're saying is, I'm going to look at enough instances so that I can identify and develop a rule, right, that allows me to predict when I see the next one that it's a face. So what I do is, I've looked at this one, it looked like a face, but I learn it's not a face. Boom, I take that one out, right? And it's sort of like Pandora deciding what I like to listen to in music, right, when I put a thumb up or down. So it seems to me that at the end of the day, all that is a digitized inductive system for developing rules. But somebody has to set the goals, right? The programmer still has to set the goals of what it's going to do. I think that the fear is that somehow it's going to create rules and go off and become, you know, the zombie apocalypse and start creating rules that cause the computers to eat the people. But it seems to me at the basic thing that's going on is the creation of inductive rather than deductive rules of inference in the smart programming, and I don't find that particularly scary. The only question is it useful? Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Follow up just for a second then. So let's say I have access to all of the case law in all of the gin joints in all of the world. And
you walked into mine.
And
Just to say, Nexus Lexus is being fed into,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I have access to all of the case law. So I can see how every judge has behaved and which ones have been overturned,
Right.
right? And I have a way to characterize the situations in which these disputes
Right.
occurred,
Right.
right? And so, in principle, regardless of what the underlying physical mechanism is, right, I could have as my goal to, as accurately as possible, simulate the social consensus about what good judging is.
Correct.
right? Recognize those patterns and behave like a situationally aware judge.
Right, right. And at that point you would have, and assuming that you bought into that, you would have the smart contract equivalent of judging, because you would accept in computer ontology terms that what is going on in the computer, I think it's actually the term, the computer ontology matches the real universe ontology,
well, the human ontology.
The human ontology
well
sufficiently that we accept it. Yeah, I'm agnostic on that. I think the problem with that is going to be computational complexity and the willingness of humans to cede that ontology to the computer.
Well, let's wave our hands around the computational complexity.
Okay.
Okay, because pretty much that fixes itself over time historically. We can get into the long distance conversation about the end of Moore's law and baloney like that, right? And also concede that, if you will, that letting the computer do it, letting the computer judge do it, because we've all gained enough confidence that we believe it can drive our car, it can fly our airplane, and it can judge routine
and it can make
disputes.
moral choices for us.
Well, let's hold off on that one. But it can judge routine commercial disputes. Situationally aware way.
Well, and judge them under what standards?
That the decisions it makes are consistent with what other good judges would do.
And but you see now I'm going to challenge your presumption, because yes, it's what another good judge would do, and the judge would adjudicate that my legal right is X, but I have decided for reasons that have nothing to do with legal rights that I don't want to do X.
So then I'm modeling the business person who says, yeah, the lawyers tell me blah, 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 but really from a business point of view, I'd rather do this.
Okay.
Right?
But sometimes I wouldn't.
You and I have both been in the room.
But sometimes I wouldn't.
And sometimes I wouldn't.
Sometimes I wouldn't.
Right.
I mean, this is the problem. This is the problem. The problem is that a set of ones and zeros are going to come into the processor. And at some point, you are going to get to a problem. You are going to get to a problem where the logic gate can only have one answer come out, and you're going to say, I don't want that answer. I don't want that answer.
And one CEO is going to say, file the suit, and another one's going to say, don't.
Right.
The point is that it's still a deterministic process. You don't get to file the suit and not file the suit.
But the decision whether I am going to file or not file is not deterministic.
It's highly contingent.
Yes.
It's highly contingent, and that.
What are we arguing about here?
I think so where I was going was to say let's take that. Let's agree.
Okay.
It's highly contingent, and we can construct a machine, a system that will behave in a plausible way for a competent CEO. It can behave like a CEO in making a litigation choice.
Okay.
Okay? In a competent way. It knows all the business facts. It knows what a competent CEO's utility function looks like, and it makes a choice.
Okay.
Right? Now, yeah, at the margin, some CEOs, less competent perhaps,
or more competent,
would have made a different choice.
Right. More inspired.
Right.
Right. So let me give you.
The thing that's going to drive. I keep going there and then having my moments. The thing that's going to drive the social acceptance of that at the end of the day, particularly if you're talking about commercial concerns, is that mechanism for making choices and getting to resolutions less expensive than the one I have now. For a given, if I turn.
It's not less expensive.
If I turn.
More optimal. More optimal.
Well, the question is, what are you optimizing for?
Because I don't know that you're just simply optimizing for lower costs, because you can sub-optimize in that case. Let me give you an example of could I program? There is an old saw. You've probably heard this if you watch Law and Order. There's an old saw when you're cross-examining a witness, that you never ask a question for which you do not know the answer, right? Yeah, you've seen this on Law and Order.
Pre-law.
Pre-law, okay. Yeah. Inspired the best cross-examiners ignore that rule all the time. So if I were going to write a cross-examining deep learning program, it would study all, right? It would start with the rule that says, I'm only going to ask questions for which I know the answer to the question. And I guess what I don't know is how would that machine learn how to ask questions for which it doesn't know the answer? Because that is the most human thing about cross-examining. I'm not saying it can't be done.
Jeff, all you've accomplished with that is to say that the AI won't be the best cross-examiner, but it can still be really a good cross-examiner.
Agreed. I agreed. It won't. It could be a really good one. Yeah. It could be a really good one. Again, a pilot could be really good at spotting traffic. I would still rather have AI do it.
So that actually kind of leads into what I was going to ask. Like when it comes to constitutional law, and I know this isn't your field or anything, but that really is about interpretation.
Yep.
And especially if, and this is very hypothetical, but like in the future, like the Constitution is changed or something, or is amended, I guess how would the AI be changed, or, you know, how would the language change, I guess, to process that?
Well, you're right. It's not my field. I think. See here. I'm gonna start down a line and see if it at some point answers your question. And if it doesn't, if I go into a loop and it starts spinning, just shut me off. Pull out the plug.
This is the law professor halting problem?
Yeah, this is the law professor halting problem. I think the problem with interpretation in constitutional law is this. That there is this fundamental complementarity or paradox in having a constitution that, like a smart contract, fixes a principle in time. It has a text, it's a program, and it says, for example, a well-regulated militia, right? There being, whatever it is necessary, the right to bear arms, right? And that sentence is written when an arm is a one-time loading musket, in which they have no conception of a semi-automatic rifle or an AK-47. And the question is, today, how should you interpret that sentence in view of the fact that the world has changed out from under you? And I think that's the kind of thing that you're asking about. And I think in constitutional law, the problem that we're always fighting and dealing with is a little bit like the problem that we deal with in religions that have liberal ends and conservative ends, right? You have an orthodoxy or a fundamentalism that says, oh my God, if we don't follow it literally word for word, anything goes, right? Anything goes. And so what we're going to do is retreat to the literal fundamental language of the Constitution or the 5 books of Moses or, you know, the New Testament or whatever. And on the other hand, people look at it and say, oh my God, why should we be bound to what somebody wrote down in 1787 or in the year 4000 BC to govern how it is that I deal with an AK-47 or same-sex marriage today, right? And that's always the problem. And so the problem is we have a text and we have change. And the text can't work like a computer program, right? It just doesn't seem to work like a computer program because we continue to have this problem setting where the algorithm that used to work to solve problems doesn't work to solve problems anymore. And I think that is the fundamental issue of of constitutional law and, frankly, religious orthodoxy versus liberalism, which is you put down a language map of rules, and then you ask it to live forever as though you were asking a piece of code to live forever. And it's really hard for the words to do that. That's
Basically, the Constitution is a dumb contract.
yeah, I think that's right. It's the dumbest contract in some ways, because who the hell knows what it means to have equal protection of the laws or due process. Well, I'm going to be thinking about that question tonight in the middle of the night.
No, that question is great. That question is really great. I am not exactly anyone familiar with coding at all. My question is more, what do you see as the overall attitude shared by the legal profession when it comes to an issue like AI?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think it divides into 3 camps. The biggest one is most people don't know jack shit about it. Sorry, is that allowed here? It's okay. They're used to it, okay. On one far extreme, you have the true believers who have drunk the Kool-Aid of AI and think that, you know, again, it's only a matter of time until the zombie apocalypse, the technological singularity, and the robots take over. And on the other hand, you have the Luddites, right? The Luddites on the far, who really would prefer that we had quill pens and dip into inkwells, because it's terrifying. And I think that those are the camps. And indeed, if you read the first couple of pages of the articles that I've written in the last couple of years about this, I sit right in the middle, which is I'm neither a Luddite nor a believer in the technological singularity. So what I'm going to do is try to practically make my way through, right, where it's better, where it's not, where it's better, where it's not. And at the point that somebody can persuade me, maybe they can, that indeed the technological singularity is coming, you know, then I'll change my mind.
Okay. Could I have a follow-up with
Sure.
that? I know we've had talk here at UMass on the idea of AI or machines as moral agents, or the possibility of that. And I was just wondering if you see a problem with ceding any more moral agency in a profession who that really...
I mean, you're talking about lawyers or coders?
I'm talking about lawyers. I'm talking about lawyers. And I'm talking about...
And then lawyers as coders, that's the worst.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering whether you think...
See, here's and I think it's a great question. Yeah. And because I'll give you the example of do I apply a rule or do I not apply a rule? And this is one that I always go back to. My children are adults now. When my son was 6 years old, and his sister was 9, she got sick. She's fine, but she got sick. She had to go to the hospital. And it was the summer, and my 6-year-old son was on our local tennis club, swim team. And it was a big deal. You know, you'd go out to the other club, and there'd be a whole team. And he was signed up to swim the 25-meter freestyle. And when he was 6 years old, it wasn't freestyle. It was really 25-meter dog paddle. And he didn't want to go. His sister had just gone into the hospital. My wife was with him, and he didn't want to go. And I made the parenting decision that said the rule is that you live up to your commitments. And you made a commitment. You're only 6 years old. You're going to go to the swim meet. And I made him swim. I made him do it. When we got there, the coach had not only put him in the 25-meter freestyle, and by the way, he had just learned how to, he had just barely, within the last few weeks preceding, learned how to get 25 meters across the pool. The coach had also put him in the 25-meter backstroke, and he was terrified. And I actually at that point thought, yeah, should I push him or not? And at that point I interceded and said, no, you don't have to.
Okay.
You don't have to.
And so
And the question is, acting as a moral agent. Within the space of half an hour, I forced him to do something and then acceded to his desire not to do something. And I do not know, I know I made the right decision, but I don't know why.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
And the question is, if I'm an AI parent, right? If I'm an AI parent, yes, could you program with enough specificity that says, right, so the parameters are the kind of circumstance, yes, 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 that's force, right? And you could have a program that says skill level, skill level, skill level, blah, 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 don't force. Yeah, you could program to that point. I have this intuitive belief that says that you can just never program in enough detail to get to all of the decisions that we human beings make in the course of a week, much less a lifetime, like that, as moral agents.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
But I think precisely one of the reasons why we want to bring AI into law is because of the irrational things that human judgment brings. And an example is the machine learning algorithms that have been trained on bail setting, sentencing, and parole hearing data. And the goal is to overcome the well-known biases.
And I'm perfectly fine with that. It's
right.
Yeah.
And to make clear through that training that our society is already racially biased,
right,
and so forth. And maybe we could tweak those algorithms then once they become explicit.
Right. And moreover, in that instance, the computer is doing something that humans aren't very good at doing, which is processing huge amounts of data, and then popping that up for, okay, if you realize that the data shows this rather than this, you really will make this decision. Yeah, I agree with that.
By the way, there was just an interesting example of that exact point from this morning. The Boston Public Schools tweaked their school allocation algorithm because it turned out that kids from Dorchester didn't get enough school choice in their school choices compared to kids from other Boston neighborhoods. And so they changed the school offering algorithms so that each kid from each neighborhood would get a school that is in sort of the right radius. And so it kind of went.
So here's the question. Could you write an algorithm that would know to change the algorithm?
Probably. I mean, that.
But then you have to write an algorithm to know whether it should change that algorithm at some point. And that's the infinite regress.
Right.
But that's the Zeno's paradox. It's like saying I can't ever hit anything with an arrow. But we do hit things with arrows all the time, right?
Right.
We come up with solutions.
We come up with solutions. We come up with solutions. And it's still I'm agnostic because I don't want to say that they never will. But all of those solutions that we come up with tend to be these aha moments of algorithm setting where we make a choice and we say, oh, the algorithm that we're using doesn't work, let's use another algorithm. And what's the algorithm for me making that decision to change the algorithm? That's my shtick, and I'm sticking to it.
I mean, Jeff, if I could say it some way, it comes down to your account of moral judgment, right? Yeah. There's an account of moral judgment that says that moral judgment is like applying a rule, yeah, right? And then there's an account, a more sort of Humean, if you want, account of moral judgment that says, I encounter something nasty. The nastiness consists in perception more than anything else, in seeing and an intuition that something is off. And then I construct the rule ex post facto to explain and justify the intuition.
Right.
And to slightly correct it, but the rule can't give me the intuition.
Right.
In the first place, and
right,
it seems like that's the camp.
Right. So yeah, the reason there is the slave of my moral passion, right? I use my reason to create the rule, as opposed to right? If you Kant, I knew I would get this in eventually.
Right.
Right.
I
So
wanted to
Kant,
give you a chance.
right? Kant, in his discussion of judgment and why judgment, right, can only be learned and can't be articulated, is the infinite regress. There is no rule for the application of a rule. That's Kant and that's Wittgenstein, right? There is no rule for the application of a rule. And because if there were a rule for the application of a rule, what is the rule for the application of that rule? And you go on infinitely. And I think that that is a fundamental difference between a Kantian outlook and a Humean outlook.
So, for example, what you're saying, so to bring this back to the legal context.
Thank God.
I mean, it's the same question, really. If I'm understanding correctly, you're saying some of the capacity of AI would have to break down in the hard cases. In the hard cases, as it were, where it's not enough to look at a pattern of past decisions, the AI is going to have a problem. And then it will need a little bit of a nudge or human intervention. So, for example, from my pretty vague memories from law school at this point, right? So the famous sort of negligence cases with reasonable care standard, and the one I remember was, you know, somebody leaving the fridge open in the backyard and a kid getting trapped into it, and that had nothing like that had ever happened before, and you know, is that negligence or not? And that's a hard case, and somebody needs to decide whether we're going to expand what we expect as reasonable care or not going to expand what we expect as reasonable care. And there's no way that an AI could decide that based on what's been decided in the past. But what could happen, and in a way this is a kind of midway solution, right, is that there could be an AI-human collaboration in a case like this, saying something like this. When you have a hard case, you kind of read the political tradition and where it's going, right? Like in a Dworkin type way. You look at your you look at your political tradition and you say, this is broadly a pro-property owner society, unlike Holland, which is a not property owner society. In a pro-property owner society, you would narrow the scope of what counts as negligence, and therefore you would decide that way. And then you would have, all you would need is the human to say, in a hard case, look at the political tradition rather than at the legal tradition, and supposedly the AI could still do that. And that, I mean, you're still right, I think.
No, and I think that that way of looking at it is actually consistent with, so one of the things that the computer science people pointed out to me was, it's not, the halting problem isn't saying that a computer can never prove that it will get to a result. It's saying that you can't say in every case that it will get to a result. So there's a whole industry of what are called proof verification programs, because you want to know, will this program work? And so they create proof verification programs. What the proof verification program will do is something like what you just said. Either it will get to the end and say, you can prove this, or this proof works, or it's going to throw up its hands and say, a human has to intervene, right? Because I can't figure this one out. And basically what you do is you tell it, if it can't come up with an answer in a certain amount of time, then we're going to assume that that is a problem that you cannot develop a proof verification program for. And that is a human AI cooperation, so to speak, right? And it's the same way as what you're, at a certain point, the algorithms can't do it on their own. We're going to get in and tweak a little bit.
So just as a follow-up, here's my sneaky recommendation of the slight leaning towards being a Luddite in the end. You are going to, I mean, this is kind of some of the project that Dan and I have been working on. One way or another, you are going to need less humans in this endeavor. And a lot of mediocre lawyers who are practicing mediocre minus practical judgment that is going to be superseded by AIs, in the sense that they're just better at reading off straightforward
Right.
past patterns are going to be put into a position where they're no longer practicing their judgment, just like loan decisions and mortgage decisions largely aren't made by humans anymore.
Data discovery.
Right? Exactly. And I think actually that Jay is right, that the machines are going to do this better than we do this. And I think that that's going to in some way be the problem. Our opportunities for making judgments are going to decrease significantly.
They're going
Just regular judgments, not
right,
fancy hard case
or
ones.
routine judgments,
Right.
routine and regularly made
But
judgments.
those are most of the judgments that people make in the process of developing their character.
Okay.
Life is routine,
Okay.
so that sucks.
Yeah.
Mandatory minimum sentence.
That's why that's why talented people will continue to make the big bucks. I don't know, you know.
Well, but at least mediocre people had the chance to develop character traits until recently. I think
I always worry about projecting into the future what technology is going to do to character traits in the future, because if I were sitting in 1880, I might make the same argument about telephones.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if telephones develop, people are never going to talk to each other. They're going to be on the phone all the time.
People say it. They did.
Yeah.
Say it.
Yeah.
Socrates was mad that kids were learning how to write.
Yeah.
And they weren't memorizing.
Yeah. So
he was right about that one.
I think we've driven out part of the audience, but
Take mandatory minimum sentences. I mean, obviously it was premature algorithmization of the law,
Yeah.
and it encoded certain kinds of social biases. So most of us aren't very happy with mandatory
Right.
minimum sentences. But then the judges who say, look, in this particular case, I don't want to apply the mandatory minimum sentence because of X, Y, and Z. Those X, Y, and Z's then can become algorithms.
right.
Right? So
Yeah.
you could come up with a better
Sure.
sentencing
Sure.
guideline. Right.
Yeah. I know almost not anything I know about criminal law. I learned from Jack McCoy on Law and Order. So, but that sounds perfectly fine to me.
One more reflection. Law, I think your image recognition thing may be very interesting in law, because from my understanding of the way most lawyers are trained and the way that they think, it's a casuistic, a case-based reasoning process. So the pattern recognition step would be apply a bunch of rules to figure out what kind of case this is and what the precedents are for that kind of case, and the guiding precedent in the field, and then you can use that case to make the final judgment.
Again, this is something I know about.
Yeah.
And the casuistry, right, is invariably in the problem setting. And so the way I teach that process, right, and the analogy process, is that in a hard case, many cases aren't hard, because socially we will all agree that this case is going to come out this way because the rule of decision is going to be this rule. And the case I use to demonstrate this, and I've talked about this in the book. There's a famous case in contract law in which it's World War II, wartime Greece. And there is a person who desperately needs money, and agrees that they take out a promissory note for 500,000 drachmas. I'm sorry, they take out a promissory note for $2,000 and receive in exchange 500,000 drachmas, even though they know at the time this is absolute wartime exploitation, because 500,000 drachmas in wartime Greece is only worth 25 bucks. But they need the 25 bucks so badly, they sign a promissory note for $2,000. After the war, they're both in Texas, and the holder of the note sues the debtor for $2,000. And the question is, will the court examine whether that should actually be enforced? And it's funny because that case shows up in the case books for the following rule. If there is a real bargain, the courts will not look at the adequacy of the consideration. And that is the rule of decision in that case. That is the actual rule of decision, right? The court says, I'm enforcing the judgment for $2,000 because it was a real bargain. The doctrine of unconscionability had not been developed, right? And so there is a countervailing rule that says, under circumstances in which at the time the parties knew that the deal was unconscionable, it is unenforceable, right? Or it is, God, I'm having another scene. It can be amended by the court, right? It can be amended, it can be reformed. The contract can be reformed. And the question is, under that set of facts, should you apply a rule of decision that says courts don't look into the adequacy of the consideration, or should you apply the rule that says courts do not enforce unconscionable contracts? And that's the rule setting. In hard cases, that's the rule setting problem. And it goes, she's not here anymore. That's the judging problem. That's the judging problem. Which rule should I apply? Because in the narrative, it's possible that in that pattern of facts, I can identify this line, or this line. And now the question is, which line should I pick as the rule of decision? That to me is what's hard about lawyering.
Friends, we're 10 minutes over, so yeah, thank you so much.